So, welcome everyone. This is Blake from Seelbach. I'm here today with Alan Bishop from Spirits of French Lick. We're going to talk about their brand new release, Lee Sinclair 4-grain bourbon. So we're going to talk about a lot of things, not just the bourbon, but just their products in general, the distillery, and a little bit of his background. So, Alan, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it, and welcome to the Seelbach channel.
Cool. Thanks for having me and picking us up and running with us, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's always great to see really cool products pop up, and when we get to bring them in and share them with others, that makes it even more fun. So we've kind of been trading messages back and forth for a while now. I always hit you with my tough distilling and fermentation and all those other questions. So give us a little bit about your background. Aside from, I believe you've been with Spirits of French Lick for 2 years now.
Yeah, about 2.5 years. So my background, basically, I always tell people I started out, on a tobacco farm, family-owned tobacco farm, and I got interested in plant breeding and organic agriculture after we had the little tobacco buyout. And I pursued that for about 10 years or so. My family has been involved in both legal and illicit distillation to some extent or the other, both Kentucky and Indiana, going back multiple generations. And I kind of got interested in distillation when I was about 15, 34 now. And I'll give you kind of the short version of that was I eventually got interested enough that I said, I want to learn how to do this. And, it's more of a skill to have than any real career pursuit. But my father and my grandfather helped me build a still. They basically turned me loose in the backyard, but they didn't tell me anything. They just said, don't blow your ass up in the backyard and bring us something when you have something worth drinking. So that's kind of where it started at. The plant breeding perspective was really what got me into the career field of wanting to pursue actual distillation, because you spend all these years kind of working on all these different open pollinated corn varieties. And at that time there was zero interest. I couldn't even get the local Amish interested in growing any of the stuff. So you think, well, I spent all the time on this. Well, what's its purpose? What can you do with it? So suddenly this little micro distilling thing starts kind of coming online and getting a little bigger and a little bigger. And you go, hey, there's all kinds of cool alternatives that nobody's played with. Maybe that's what I need to look into. And that kind of put me on the path. And I hooked up with Lisa Wicker, who's a very good friend of mine, works for Sampson and Surrey. And then she also at one point in time worked for Limestone Branch Distillery. And she really encouraged me to get into the business and to go after it and kind of put me in the right place at the right time. I got hired on at another distillery in Louisville, Kentucky, worked there for a couple of years, and want to get back on this side of the Ohio, what we Hoosiers call the right side of the Ohio. So.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into that debate. That's I'll leave that for all the Kentuckians to fight right over the Ohio River. But that's very interesting. So I want to go back to one thing you said about just the micro distilling. Now, I read that you have a little bit of a problem with the name craft distilling. Do you get caught up in that distinction, or where do you see the difference between calling it craft distilling or micro distilling, or is it even an issue?
I flip-flop about it. So I'm not hard sold on any of those particular distinctions necessarily. And unless you are calling yourself a quote unquote craft distiller, when it's more appropriate to maybe call yourself a craft rectifier, but that doesn't sound nearly as sexy as a craft distiller.
Yeah. Craft blender would be more appropriate. Right. Yeah.
I don't see anybody putting that on their label anytime soon. Mm-hmm. I feel like a lot of times craft distillers, ones who are more keen on learning the history of distilling and really reading about it and listening to stories and going back and finding their local history, I think a lot of times that they really have much more in common with the way that farm distillers were operating in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of sad that we've not seen that distinction made just quite yet. As opposed to, are they craft or aren't they craft, or are they a big distillery, or who owns part of it, or that sort of thing. I consider myself a craft distiller, but I'm not sure what that means to anyone else in their eyes, if that has any weight or value whatsoever. I imagine that it's a balance of are you small, but do you also make a good quality product? Because if you don't have a good quality product, it doesn't matter ultimately what you are, whether you're big or small. So
yeah. And that's what I always run into with people. A lot of times people say, well, I don't like craft bourbon, or I don't like craft whiskey. And it's probably not because there aren't any good craft bourbons or any good craft whiskeys. You're probably just drinking the wrong ones. And not to say that their stuff is bad. Maybe it needs more time. Maybe they just need to change some things up. They're still learning. So to me, that's kind of the exciting part of this, as well as just all the grain experimentation and really what y'all are doing. So now I know the food movement has probably helped a lot of resurrecting all these heirloom grains and everything, but craft distillers are playing a really big role. You think about just the Jimmy Red bourbon, or a lot of different red corn bourbons, Bloody Butcher, those kind of things popping up. Are you seeing that as well? These smaller distilleries taking an interest in these different grains?
I am. So I having my plant breeding background, I have, and of course, that's all self-taught as well. But I ran a forum for a very long time for plant breeders, and so it was always funny to me the first few years when I got into this that there seemed to be very little communication between these independent amateur plant breeders and then distillers. But now I get more and more calls like, "Hey man, what do you know of any other corns? Do you know of any other stuff out there that you can put me in contact with?" And there's a lot of distillers looking for stuff. Everybody's looking for their own footprint. So now you're actually seeing that level where I'm able to put distillers in contact with plant breeders and hook them up with some really unique germplasm that will make some really unique whiskeys in the future. I also think that's what makes what you do really interesting, because, and I'm guilty of it too. So when I go to the liquor store, I have been quote unquote burnt enough times by bad craft whiskey that I still have that thing. Like if I go in a liquor store and I see a bottle, and it might even be a bottle from somebody I know, but I've not tried it, I go, I should buy that and try it. And then I look at it and I look at the price point and I go, or I can buy Old Forester for $24 and and know what I'm getting. So and it's an uphill battle, but it's going to take good distillers and good people like you who are pushing those concepts out there to get people to pick that up. Have somebody that knows bourbon and can vet it the way that you do, taste it and vouch for it, and put it out there on the line. That's what's really going to build the industry. Because a distiller like me, I can pop off at the mouth all day long. It doesn't mean jack to any of these guys. One bad review for better or worse, whether it's an actual legitimate review or someone just doesn't like you in the industry, and it kind of sinks your product if you don't have somebody to back it up. So
yeah. And now, as far as, I mean, obviously you have a different plant structure. I don't even know what it is. What's making up the difference between some of these heritage grains and just, because what kind of corn are the big distillers using? I know it's just general white corn, or not necessarily feed corn, but
actually, yeah, that's basically what you're dealing with most of the time. Of course, there's some interesting Buffalo Trace experiments, etc. But typically, number 2 yellow dent corn, and we do use a lot of yellow number 2 dent corn. The majority of our products do have that, and that's pretty common. But what's making up the difference is really the use of alternative small grains. We use a lot of oats and quinoa, or not quinoa, I'm sorry, kasha, buckwheat, things like that here. But what's really making up the difference with corn is that a lot of these corns have different color compounds to them. So each of those color compounds is a different amino acid, and all of those amino acids have their own flavor compounds. So anthocyanin, zeaxanthin, carotenoid compounds, they're also all water soluble. So the beautiful thing about distillation is that ethanol really carries no flavor and water does. So with bourbon, you've got that distillation ceiling. As long as you stay below that distillation ceiling of 160, you're going to carry those compounds across into that raw spirit, and you're going to pull the flavors of each of those individual corns across and hold on to them and retain them. A lot of times I think that guys and I know I do, and it's probably just my background, guys who are playing with these small grains and who are playing with heirloom grains and really trying to do something different with those, I think we really approach our distillations a lot more like a brandy distiller would. We're real focused on the raw material. We're very focused on balancing that, retaining the best parts of it that we possibly can, and then going into the barrel and not trying to finish in the barrel to the extent that you don't taste any of that anymore. We want you to taste those individual components. It's just a completely different style of distillation. And not one that I feel in any way takes away from any of the big guys, because they all make excellent product. Those Kentucky guys are big because they know what they're doing. know. But we as craft distillers, we don't necessarily have to compete with them, because we're not going to get the guy whose drink is on an everyday basis. You know, even on the lower end level, an old granddad, he's not going to trade in an old granddad for what we do, and we know that. So.
Which is interesting, just because the you know, like with craft beer, you kind of have the big guys making a very bland, whatever, different product. That's not really the way it is in bourbon, especially because they are making some great bourbons, and it's like the smaller guys are catching up. They don't have the uniqueness initially. They got to wait 2 to 3 years at least to kind of show off that uniqueness. Now, with different corn and grain types, are you seeing a difference in the fermentation process as well, or is it pretty similar to, you know, if you're just using a standard mash bill?
It depends on a lot of factors. So for us, the corn we did this last year, we grew 15 acres of corn that I named Amanda Palmer. I tend to name things after musicians I like, and, you know, artists and stuff like that.
I like it.
But it's a real high protein corn. I would imagine that if I wanted to, I could probably ferment that out in 3 or 4 days. But we were playing with a couple of different brandy yeasts, and again, trying to hold on to some of those fruity profiles and those fruity esters that we wanted to get from it. We ended up doing a 1075 specific gravity mash bill, and we ran that 6-day fermentation. So, which is a pretty slow fermentation for most bourbons. And with that particular mash bill, what we did is we wanted to focus basically on that corn. So that mash bill is pretty standard. It's an 80% corn mash bill, 10% rye, and then 10% malt. And that's, again, just to retain as much of that corn as what we can and put the real focus and emphasis on that. But you could potentially take any of those corns and treat them just like the yellow number 2 and run them the exact same way, just for variation's sake. So.
Interesting. And now, one more question on the distillation portion. So you said you're using more of like a brandy-esque. Are you on alembic stills or pot stills?
So we have 3 stills. So our big still, our stripping still, and they're all named. If you ever go to
everything gets named, the grain, the stills.
Yeah. They're all named. So if you ever go to a distillery, I'm going to throw this out for other distillers that you're going to be to. So you should always ask them to name their stills.
Okay.
Because distillers can be superstitious or a superstitious lot. So I wouldn't get on a ship that didn't have a name. I wouldn't on a still that doesn't have a name, or whatever that's worth. So the 1,200-gallon stripping still, her name's Lilith. She is a pot still with an offset 4-plate column. The column is really just there for nothing more than to show the tourists as they come through, so that I can explain reflux and rectification, that sort of thing. We never use it on that stripping still whatsoever. All the bourbons are double pot distilled. All the whiskeys are double pot distilled. Most of the brandies are double pot distilled. There are a few Calvados style apple brandies have been single pass. When we get into the H3 room where we do all the doubling at and make our cuts at, the first still named Sophia, she's a 350-gallon copper alembic, and then she has an offset gin basket, an offset 8-plate whiskey column, and an offset 12-plate vodka column. All of that stuff is being bypassed as far as we're not forcing any reflux. But what I do is I allow the vapor to flow from the pot still into the 8-plate column without any reflux being forced. So I'm just using that 8-plate column to have that much more copper contact, essentially, and a little more natural reflux. The Anana, which is our 450-gallon pot still, she's actually a hybrid. So she's a pot with a 4-plate column on top. We're not forcing any reflux through that column. Again, it's just there for the natural reflux as well as the copper surface area, essentially. So the goal is really to pull off as much of that flavor profile as what we can without any forced rectification whatsoever. Of course, we probably get a little more reflux than what most pots do because we do have those columns that we can run vapor through. That said, you know, I've done little cheats like that to get a little slightly lighter bodied spirit over time at other distilleries too. The last place I worked, they had some copper alembics and some big hangar doors out front. Well, I'd wait till the wintertime. If I needed a little bit of reflux, I'd open those hangar doors up and let that cold air come in, and you could just see that it would slow the flow down, and you get a little lighter bodied spirit as you went. But you were still well within your proof margins.
That's interesting. Now, could you give us, just for those who don't know, a quick about the reflux. So what's actually happening there when that reflux is happen or when that reflux is going on, and with the different adjustments, how that makes a difference?
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So basically, what you're doing. So reflux is essentially vapor alcohol traveling through condensed liquid alcohol, and when the two come together, see if I can. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Two come together. What happens is you have an exchange. So water falls back out and alcohol rises, and the more of that you force, and again, we don't force any of it with any of the bourbons whatsoever. The more of it you force with a small condenser, the higher your proof and the higher your purity. But for the higher proof and the higher purity you have, you're basically sacrificing flavor and aroma. And of course, aroma is about 90% of what you actually taste. So if you lose the aroma of that raw material, the only flavor you're going to have on the other end is going to be from the barrel, essentially. So, which is exact opposite of what we want. So our motto here is respect the grain, and the whole idea behind that is when we're done and we're finished and we have matured spirit, we want you to taste 50% distiller's art, what we did from start to finish, and then 50% barrel. And then the taste of the barrel that we do here is a little bit different from a traditional Kentucky bourbon as well. So,
Yeah. And just kind of on that same note, so if you're watching this and ever seen a distillery where they have the different windows, usually that's where they have what do they call it, plates or whatever. And so they're forcing the reflux to happen, and the higher it goes, the more it gets rectified. So then by the end of it, you just have a more neutral spirit the more it's rectified, which is always interesting to see how people, play with that and adjust it in their spirits, because you could probably go too far as well. If you get too much coming over, you're getting some off flavors. So I imagine you're trying to balance that whole thing out as well as you go.
the other thing about that too is that columns can make very good, very, very good spirit. It's just a differentiated version of distillation, depending on what you want. So for us, that old cognac style double pot distilled distillation is where we feel like our strong suit is at. So
Yeah, I feel like the column makes so much now because it's so efficient. A double distilled pot still is not, I mean, it's much more labor intensive, it's not continuous. So that probably fell off mainly just for economic reasons. I like to say the accountants got involved, because as an accountant, I can say, we usually screw up craftsmanship and art because we only see dollars and cents. But
let me see your numbers.
Yeah. But not to say that it's better or worse, but you probably do lose a lot of that pot distillation and all the Olympic stills just because it's much less inefficient, or
much more efficient. Yeah. So that's
more efficient. Yeah.
That's what I tell people. So there's an analogy that's a fun one. So the analogy is that a column still is like an electric guitar and a pot still is like an acoustic guitar. They're both doing kind of the same thing, but a pot still is very unforgiving of any kind of mistake that you make. So a pot still is very percussive, and it's a reflection of the distiller, the day that he's running it. Everybody has a bad Tuesday, but what's funny is you get into the barrel and you get down the road a couple of years and you're like, well, that one's a little bit different, but it's better than the other ones. And you're like, oh, that was a bad day though. That day, but it's something you wouldn't normally hit, So
that's where you look at the barreled on date or, the run date, and it's like, oh man, my dog died that day. Of course this bourbon is terrible. You expected.
So you don't, with pot still distillation, you don't create consistency, you manage it essentially. So and that's the goal, is that at the end of the road, when the barrels are coming up on maturity, then it's about blending and balancing what you want. And the flavor profiles are fun, because when we got into Lee Sinclair, we pulled out 4 distinct profiles, and we had to blend from those 4 profiles to hit what we've got. And those profiles were ranging anywhere from, we had one that was very floral, almost jasmine-like on the nose. And then we had others that were on the far end, and they were like cinnamon to the extreme, like almost like big red chewing gum cinnamon. I mean, they were way on that end. And some of those were going to make interesting single barrels, I think, just because they're off profile and they're a little different, a little more intense. So, but it was neat seeing how that all played out.
Yeah, well, that's a good lead in. So let's talk about the Lee Sinclair bourbon, the first bourbon released from Spirits of French Lick. So it's a mash bill of corn, wheat, oats, and caramel malt. Barrel entry proof of 105, and then went into char number 2 barrels, 53 gallons. So let's start with the mash bill. You don't see a lot of caramel malt being used, aside from some different American single malts and that kind of stuff. What played a role in that decision to add that in there?
So one of the reasons for the caramel malt was that we knew that this particular bourbon style was going to be a little sweeter style because you're dealing with wheat and you're also dealing with oats. So you're going to get a lot of that kind of cake frosting sort of thing, and we wanted to round that out, but we want that roundness and that contrast to come from a sweet element. So the caramel malt held up to that. The other reason was we knew we were going to go into number 2 char barrel, which we'll talk about in a little while. So we knew that we weren't going to extract a ton of caramel and vanilla from that barrel. So we can start out by having a little bit of that caramel flavor in that raw distillate, and that makes up for any lack that would have come from the barrel because we're trying to pull other elements out of the barrel as we go. I'm surprised and I'm starting to see and I'm hoping that other distillers are going to play with some of these interesting malts too, because you can take something like the APH Stitzel wheated recipe and you can make it your own just by throwing a different malt in there. You can be running the same mash bill as 3 of the big guys in Kentucky, but have your own variation on it just by your selection of malt.
Wait, I had a bourbon. It was from Tom's Foolery out in Ohio. They did a chocolate malt, and it was just like this, such a confusing, because on the nose you're like, oh man, this is dark chocolatey single malt, and then you taste it and it's like, no, this is bourbon. Did I switch glasses? But it just had such a crazy profile on it. It was really interesting. Now the choice for no rye, was that just didn't want the spiciness in there, not the profile? I feel like wheated bourbon, we're seeing more of it, but in general, the majority of bourbon's still made with rye in the mash bill.
So what's funny is that recipe, the 60 corn, 13 oats, 17 wheat, 10 malt, that was an old recipe that I did at home that I came up with on my own, and I've carried it on through my career. But I did used to occasionally play around with rye with that recipe. And for whatever reason, the contrast between rye and oats just doesn't seem to play well together. So I've always kind of stayed away from that. And then I also knew that down the road here, and we already are, we have been for the past 2 years, that we were going to do some rye-based products here. So I felt like there was a good opportunity to hit more of that sweeter note and have a product that was more appealing to someone who may not traditionally be a bourbon drinker, by having a little bit more sweetness between the oats and the caramel and the wheat, as opposed to, right now everybody's on rye. They're on high rye bourbons, they're on rye whiskey, and they're great products, and I love them myself personally. That's where I go to. But I felt like there was an underexploited market there that we could get into, and really introduce people who normally don't like bourbons to something. They go, wow, that's a bourbon that's accessible and I like, and it's not just rye, spice, and caramel just hitting me up front and knocking me down. So
interesting. Yeah, well, let's move on to the next portion, which is we got a couple interesting parts of the equation. So we got 105 proof barrel entry. So if you're not familiar, the max is that you can go into the barrel with bourbon. So the proof that you can put into the barrel is 125 proof. The majority of distilleries today are using 125 proof. Once again, I'll cut down on accountants. The accountants get involved. You get more product at the end if you go in at a higher proof. But historically speaking, bourbon has gone in at a much lower proof. And so y'all use 105 proof. And then this is one, aside from maybe a few toasted barrels, I don't know of anyone else using char number 2. So what went into that decision on those 2 items?
So they're both closely related, essentially. So the 105 proof is for a couple reasons. I wanted to go low proof because when you go low proof into a barrel, oxidization happens in a different way. It's also accelerated a little bit. Not that maturation is not accelerated at all, just oxidization. So when you go in at a higher proof, the alcohol molecules are more stable. You go into a lower proof, they're a little less stable. So the aging happens a little bit differently. As well, water is actually a better solvent than alcohol is. So when we go into that barrel with a lower proof, we're actually able to penetrate into that barrel and break down more lignin and more cellulose with that lower proof than we would be at a high proof. So we're pulling those notes that we wanted out of it. There are a few guys that are playing with number 2 char, but we're using number 2 char exclusively. And it's one of the reasons for it is A, to obviously differentiate ourselves, but B, the qualitative thing that we're pulling from a number 2 char is that we're really going for that lignin content. We're also toasting before we char, so we're pulling the sugars out as well. What we're after is more of like a toffee, hazelnut, coconut sort of aromas, things that are going to play well with that fruity distillate that we're already making as our base spirit. That's what we wanted to pull through. Again, too, if we went with a number 3 or a number 4, some of these grains that we use are very volatile. So we would lose the aroma and the flavor very quickly if caramel and vanilla was just, pounded into it. And that plays into even more the maturation thing, like our chai, our cellar that we use for our maturation program, which you may want to get into later. I don't know. But that's a whole different thing from what anyone else is doing. But those things are all part of that process, trying to find that balance and that blend that hits what we do and what we feel like our high points are, while trying, not to take the road that everyone else has taken or is taking. So.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I'm very excited for this. Oh, one more thing. So who was Lee Sinclair?
Okay, so Lee Sinclair is our name. Obviously, Spirits of French Lick plays into twofold thing: the spirits we make, but also the spirits who once inhabited the towns of French Lick and West Baden. If you've never been to French Lick or West Baden, or you don't know the history of it, we have a very deep, long, interesting love affair with vice in French Lick and West Baden. So there were at one point in time 9 casinos and hotels in this valley, in what they call Springs Valley. None of them were ever legal, not ever legal until recently. The Indiana State Police were put together to basically police this area originally. So Lee Sinclair is the one that kind of started this whole thing off. He came here in the late 1800s and he bought this old hotel called the Baden Lick Hotel. And what he did was he added another 200 and something rooms to it. He'd been a businessman from the county I'm from, Washington County, Salem, Indiana. He owned the New Albany State Bank, Salem State Bank, just a money man, just big time money man. Well, he got here, ran the place for a couple of years. It burned down. He was real dejected. His daughter talked him back into rebuilding it and opening it up. And he thought, okay, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right. So he rebuilt it bigger than it was, put in the largest freestanding dome in the world on this place in the atrium. Did it in really like a real Spanish, almost missionary sort of style. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous building with a lot of history. We were renowned here in the valley, in the low parts of the valley. We have a lot of sulfur springs, so there were a lot of athletes that would come here and use that as sort of a spring tonic. Several baseball teams would actually do their spring training here, etc. So Lee Sinclair, our bourbon is a tribute to him as a man. He would have known good bourbon in his time, and he certainly would have served it around here. So we wanted to do him right and do him proud. We exist on Sinclair Street, so there's a lot of little things that add up and add to our story.
Very cool. No, I like. There's something about having a person's name on a bottle that just makes it a little more appealing for whatever reason. You think about all the huge bourbon brands. You have Jack Daniels, you have Jim Beam, you have Evan Williams, you have Elijah Craig. Just seems to be cool to carry on that tradition as well. I'd like to pick a private barrel and call it the Larry Bird Reserve in honor of French Lick as well. Yeah. But we'll talk about that after the show.
So there's, I mentioned the superstition thing, right? I got to tell you this because I think people get a kick out of these fun little stories. And I'm not, as you've seen on Facebook, I like making fun of marketing. So it sounds like a marketing story, but it's not.
As do we, but yeah, I love it.
So the very first bottle of Lee Sinclair actually got. I took it to his mausoleum and all that stuff because the more I thought about it, I was like, I don't want to wake up in the middle of the night and Lee Sinclair be standing at the foot of my bed being like, why the hell did you use my name on that bottle? Nobody else would probably do that, but it's like stuck in my craw. First bottle comes online, grabbing it, taking it. He's getting the first one, so he's got it.
Hey, there's one way to keep the spirits from haunting you in your dreams. You give them bourbon. It's just like anyone else. If you offer some bourbon, you're probably good.
Yep. All you get to
Very cool. Yeah. So, and just if you're watching this, the product will be available on seelbox.com. Just search Lee Sinclair or French Lick. We're doing a pre-order now. Let's see. It'll probably start sometime later this week or maybe early next week. And we're at, let's see, August 14th. So if it's not in pre-order, it's probably in just regular fulfillment. So go ahead and check it out. But before we wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about the other spirits you have in your line, because y'all have some really interesting ones that I think highlight the area as well. Not even just the Old Town Gin, but some of the different kind of, I guess you put them in the brandy category, that kind of thing. So what are some of your favorites from the lineup?
So we've got, I don't know, there's like 23 or 24 different things in the pipeline back there. Obviously some of which are just going to be, out front here at the gift shop, whatever. But some of the interesting things we have coming up. So we have a rum, double pot distilled white rum, that's called Stamper's Creek. So Stamper's Creek here in Orange County was kind of a mecca for distillers. Southern Indiana sets on limestone just like Kentucky does, and in that particular township there were 9 commercial distilleries that operated from about 1812 up to about 1914. The photo on the front of the rum bottle is actually a photo of one of the spring houses for the McCoy distillery that would have fed the McCoy apple brandy distillery. It is a funky white rum. I've never tasted anything like it. It was the coldest fermentation I've ever done. It was done at 57 degrees for almost, I think, 17 days. So it's also the longest fermentation I've ever done. So that one I'm real excited about. The other one I'm very excited about is we're working on our label approval right now for an apple brandy that'll be out in October. That'll be 2-year-old apple brandy, double pot distilled, went into wine barrels that I took down to Kelvin Cooperage, had those guys shave them down 1/8 of an inch and rechar them. And that's actually going to be named after an old distillery in Washington County called Old Clifty, which was a huge apple brandy distillery. So as you can see, we try to play off some of that history as much as possible. I always tell people the only difference between us and Kentucky is we didn't have the publicists they had after Prohibition. So, I have to be publicist and distiller at the same time when it comes to that.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of. It's a Swiss Blanche style absinthe. It's definitely in the vein of a French absinthe, but using some of the coloring herbs in the distillation as opposed to post-distillation maceration. The Old Tom Gin has done well for us as far as getting us some attention through awards. And of course, those don't necessarily mean much. As long as the consumer likes it, I'm happy. But it's drawn some attention to us because there's so many gins out there. How do you differentiate yourself?
Mm-hmm.
The way I approach that particular product is, if you don't like gin, you probably might like this one. This one is a gin that you can take and put in a glass on the rocks, and you can drink it like a whiskey. It doesn't taste like drinking a Christmas tree. It's very fruity. There's 5 different citrus elements in it, a little bit of Ceylon cinnamon. I actually think it would make an excellent eggnog. So coming up on Christmas later on this year, that's one I'm going to play around with. And it holds up well in cocktails. So there's always something new happening back here. I have a section in the barrel house that's just like kind of the weird stuff that Alan did on a Tuesday when nothing else was going on. So
the barrel playground is.
Yes. We also have the other bourbon that we came out with too. Is we call it the Weeder. Of course, you guys that are bourbon guys know that weeded bourbons tend to get called Weeders on the forums. So we thought that we would. Best way to say that, appropriate the term and go with the Weeder. So it's basically the old APH Stitzel recipe. That one is 60% my 2-year-old weeded bourbon, again with caramel malt, and then it's another 40% of merchant bourbon that we purchased from out in Wyoming, and it's a nice representation of what a weeded bourbon should be. So, and the reason we kind of went after that too was we knew Lee Sinclair was going to be a little bit different. So you're going to get some hardcore rye guys in here, and they're like, I don't know about Lee Sinclair. And then they're going to be like, oh, do you have anything more in the traditional sense? Well, here's a weeded bourbon that's maybe a little closer to what you're after. So we're trying to do something a little bit for everybody. We'll also have I think we're going to call it William Henry Harrison. We'll see. We're working on that. So rye whiskey that'll be out in, I would say, October. That's based on the old George Washington mash bill. It's for a 2-year-old rye. I'm extremely happy with it. It is matured tremendously this past summer in our barrel room. So.
And actually, so one more question on that. I feel like I just have more and more questions popping in as we go, but you actually spent a little time at the Washington or George Washington Distillery. What was it, this past spring?
Yes, back.
So how does that process work? Do they, the Historical Society tap you, or are you in some kind of secret Distillers Alliance that we can't talk about on the show, or how does that?
We don't call it the Distillers Alliance, but we call it the Drunk Avengers.
Oh, nice. Even better. Yeah.
So, I have been harassing Steve Bayshore and Lisa Wicker, excuse me, for quite some time.
I've found persistent pays off a lot. You may not be that person's favorite person, but if you get to go there, hey, I'm okay with it.
There's also potentially a line like persistence and annoyance.
Yeah,
like at some point, if you say yes to him, he'll come. You'll have to deal with him for a week, and then you can kind of put him off to the side. No, so basically what happens is you get elected by or nominated by your peers. And Lisa Roper Wicker nominated myself and Sean Stevens. Sean is one of the craftsmen at Vendome Copper and Brass in Louisville, Kentucky. Very good friend of mine. He also runs a little website called The Copper Onion. But we got elected to go down there. Sean put up with me for like the 9-hour drive. I don't know how he dealt with that because I'm sure it didn't shut up the whole time. So we got to go out there and make George Washington rye whiskey on the 5 different pot stills and see how those 5 different pot stills operated. We spent a lot of time splitting wood and feeding fires and doing all that stuff. And man, it's like if you're a distiller in America, that is your mecca is the George Washington Distillery. To get to go there and to stand in a place with as much history as what that has, and how much influence that had on the early industry, that's pretty amazing. So.
Yeah, because you're essentially working as they did in 1700s, correct? There's no electricity, you're just working off a true fire underneath the still. And is that a pretty difficult task to maintain? Because, distillation, fermentation, everything's so exact and scientific. I mean, how do you manage?
Kind of fun about it is you're using some of the old 17 and 1800s technology and methodology. And even though they're a little outmoded compared to modern industry, they're still pretty correct as far as fermentation. They knew how things worked, but maybe not why they worked.
They didn't know the why. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. But the still firing, for example, is a lot of fun. So all 5 of those stills, and all pot stills are like this, but all 5 of those stills have their own personality and they all run their own way. One of them has a dedicated furnace. So it's a flue that goes straight back. So when you're filling it up with wood, you can build the fire right in the middle and you can hold it there and it's perfect. The others have shared furnaces. So there are sweet spots where you need them to be a little hotter at or a little cooler at. And it's pretty intensive because you have to check those fires about every 5-10 minutes. And then you get to where you can kind of read the flow of the spirit coming off the still. Mm-hmm. By how fast it's coming off the still, that you're where you need to be at. But then you got to be watching because the minute that it starts to fall back, oh, okay, I got to mess with the fire now. And there was one day, the best day that we were out there, Steve had to send some of his guys out to lunch. And so it ended up being me and Sean and Steve and Lisa. And I ended up being in charge of 2 of the stills and also was in charge of hauling wood at the same time and splitting wood. So it was just constant back and forth. But the challenge of it is what made it fun, because you take for granted when you come into a modern distillery, all the things that we have that make this so much easier. And then you get in that situation, you're like, man, those guys produced 11,000 gallons and 99, I believe it was, this way. This is the hardest way you could possibly do this, And so those guys were real distillers, whether they knew how it worked or not, or why it worked. They knew how it worked. So
that's interesting. Yeah, I think it's difficult to keep my smoker between a 10 to 15 degree variance, and I'm checking about every hour or so. I could not even imagine on a still, because at the end of the day, if it gets too hot, you get a little more crust on your brisket or whatever it is get a little too hot here, you ruin the entire batch. So
You scorch whiskey and it's done with.
yeah. Well, very cool. Well, we can go ahead and wrap it up there. So Alan, I appreciate the time. Any other closing remarks or information you wanted to get in? Feel free to go ahead.
I always feel like I should throw something clever in there, but it's morning.
You want like a closing line? Yeah, it's your go-to catchphrase.
We'll just go with this morning. We'll go with respect the grain. That's
perfect. That's good, and I believe y'all really are respecting the grain. So it's great to share y'all's story and your products on the Seelbach site. So thanks for coming on again. And if you're looking for any French Lick products, go to seelbachs.com. That's SEELBACHS. And thank you for watching. Thanks.